Uh, Real life actually has a lot to do with what I write. I put a little bit of myself in each of the stories, as well as my own experiences, things that people have told me, news events, my own emotions and things that I've gone through. To me, it feels more organic to do that. If I can love the characters, if I can have sympathy with them, it makes telling their story that much more enjoyable. And occasionally, I will take an event in mundane life, something small, and brainstorm around it and flesh it out until it becomes a story. Like turbulence on an airline flight. Really bad turbulence. Now the story, Myers Mercy was born from this idea and fleshed out with hypothetical questions. Could it have been worse? And what might make it abruptly stop? Now in this story we meet Captain Jonathan Meyer. He's been an airline pilot for 17 years. You know, he's been through some rough flights. He usually keeps his cool. But when the plane's right engine blows, he begins to get a little nervous. He has a very inexperienced rookie co-pilot with him named Jesus Alvarez, who unfortunately is also suffering violently from air sickness. So he's leaving him on his own to deal with this catastrophe. You going to make it, kid? I'm trying, sir. If we come out of this alive, I've already promised the Lord I'll become a priest. What, and give up all this? Captain Meyer rejoined with a sardonic smile. Jesus gave the tiniest of nervous grins. It was clear this would be the young man's last flight, whether or not they landed safely. Jonathan himself had experienced turbulence before, some of it truly terrible, but he had never encountered something like this. A slightly heavier respiration was all that marked his apprehension. He was a seasoned professional, trained not to betray his own fear or to surrender to it if he could help it. There were 120 passengers back there that needed him to do his job, to function according to protocol, not emotion. This was the closest he had ever come to true panic. Jesus started to make gulping noises again. He remained in his chair for about 10 more seconds before making a mad dash to the cramped lavatory. His timing was perfect. No sooner had he left the cabin than the left engine commenced choking. Meyer ran his hands through his graying brown hair. This was it. His wife, Josie, would be left to raise their 2 teenage daughters alone. Nor would they be the only abandoned families in mourning. In all likelihood, every person on the jetliner had a life on the ground. Many had spouses, children, parents, or siblings that would be devastated. Never having spoken aloud to the divine, he decided to grasp at that one desperate straw. Please, save them. If I can do it, if there's something I can do to keep this plane from going down, show me the way. As it happens, Captain, I may be able to help. Meyer spun around in his chair. There was a man standing in the doorway, wearing a tailored black suit that appeared far too expensive for the average coach patron. It would be difficult to state his age. He could have been a mature 30-year-old, or an amazingly well-preserved man in his late 40s, possibly older. His carefully combed ebony hair was devoid of any white strands, as was his trendily trimmed goatee. The imposing dark eyes were set off by the whiteness of his unlined skin, giving him an exotic appearance. Whatever his origin, he wasn't a member of the flight crew. I'm sorry, sir. You're going to have to return to your seat. Passengers aren't allowed in the cockpit. The man only chuckled. You may change your mind once you hear what I have to offer. This plane might just make it to Utah after all, although hell only knows why anyone would want to go there. Captain Meyer was intrigued. There were rumors of danger in the air already, with a few of the more paranoid passengers fanning the flames. The flight attendants did their best to soothe, of course, but even they couldn't assuage the group after the right engine died. It had blown with a conspicuous flare, startling the folks looking down at the twinkling suburbs on the starboard side of the plane. Repeated reassurance that everything would be fine and that the captain had everything firmly under control fell on deaf ears. Therefore, this man could easily have guessed their predicament without a direct communication. Perhaps he had an engineering background and possessed knowledge of some crucial element that Meyer had overlooked. What sort of help do you propose, sir? Well, it's no secret to me or anyone else on board that we're flying with one functioning engine. The other, by the sound of it, won't last much longer. By my estimate, we have no more than 5 minutes left until we plummet to the ground below. The captain sighed. You still haven't told me. Don't worry, I'm getting to that. The question I must first pose to you is, would you do anything to save those people? Yes, of course. Would you sacrifice yourself in return for a promise to preserve over 100 innocent souls? Yes. Good. One rarely sees such nobility these days, and I'm glad to find one unselfish man in 10,000. I'm not asking you to die, no. This is merely a spiritual quid pro quo. The deal I offer is one soul, namely yours, for one plane's safety and for that of its occupants. My soul, is this a joke? Jonathan Meyer was not in a humorous mood. Absolutely not. Put simply, you sign my contract, effectively transferring ownership of your immortal essence to me, and I keep us in the sky until we land safely at our destination. How exactly you're going to do that? Who are you? How I'll do it isn't important. We have just under 3 minutes left, by the way. As for who I am, you're telling me you really don't know? Care to hazard a guess? Meyer was growing frustrated. I can only assume that you're either a sociopath with a very morbid sense of humor or a very ill young man who has deluded himself into believing he's the devil. The stranger laughed aloud at this. Your first assumption would be closer to the truth, but it omits so many of my finer qualities. Now, before it's too late, I'm offering you the opportunity of a lifetime. He produced a parchment scroll, rapidly unrolled it, and extended a golden pen alongside it. Responding to the captain's incredulous look, he said, If I am indeed a nut job, as common slang would label such a misguided person, signing my contract would have no effect whatsoever. On the other hand, if I'm who I purport to be, your signature will make you a hero. You don't have long to decide, however. As if to punctuate his point, the left engine gave a bucking whine. What do you really have to lose, Captain Meyer? Every ounce of his intellect told Jonathan that this was impossible. It was ludicrous to think that ink scribbled on paper would repair his plane's ailing engines. There was no reason to this whole proceeding, no conceivable method to justify this madness. With every audible tick of his watch's second hand, the watch Josie had given him for his birthday 5 years ago, part of his life slipped away. Driven by impulsively blind hope, he hastily grabbed the pen and endorsed the document, cognizant of his own foolishness in doing so. His guest smiled as he rolled up the contract and replaced it, along with the extravagant pen, in his left breast pocket. The dark man closed his eyes, abruptly deep in concentration. Immediately, the left-hand engine regained its customary sound, without a trace of troubling noise. Shortly afterward, there was a swift kick from the right side of the plane, as the defunct engine roared back into life. Examining the control panel, the captain was baffled to find that all was well once again. They were regaining altitude, the alarming red lights were no longer blinking, and the 737 was flying as smoothly as it had upon takeoff. He turned to question the young man who was no longer there. He must have gone back to his seat, he thought, and was on the verge of pursuing him when Alvarez returned to the cockpit. Captain Meyer broke into a broad grin, and poor Jesus thought the man may have lost his mind while he was busy losing his supper. Look, Jonathan said, gesturing toward the instruments and indicators. The co-pilot was at a loss regarding what he saw. Is this some kind of final malfunction or something? No, believe it or not, we're going to be okay. The engine's working again, everything's back to normal. His subordinate clearly did not believe him. See for yourself. Alvarez did just that, bursting into the cabin and forcing his way to a window. The inky smoke that had been visible against the moonlit indigo sky was no longer pouring from the wing. Unbelievably enough, everything appeared to be in working order. The young man could no longer maintain his composure. He began to weep, clasping his hands together in prayerful gratitude. Bumbling back to the aisle, he blurted out, "It's okay, everything's okay. Thank God, we're all going to live." His outburst was greeted with cheers by some, tears of relief by others, and joy from all. Jesus ran back into the cockpit and hugged Captain Meyer. "It's a miracle. God has saved us." "Okay, kids, settle down. There's no other way to explain it. You saw the state of those engines. We were all going to die. We've been spared by the Almighty." Alvarez was grinning from ear to ear. Sure, all right. We're not on the ground yet, though, so let's see to it that this plane makes it to Utah before we start jumping for joy. Yes, sir. There was no withstanding the co-pilot's jubilance. Meyer smiled in spite of himself. A few hours later, the jetliner safely touched down at the Salt Lake City International Airport, and the captain himself greeted each passenger upon their departure. As the last of them, a gentleman in his 50s who was clearly struggling with his carry-on luggage, exited the plane, Meyer looked around. His cryptic visitor had not been among the crowd. Addressing one of the younger flight attendants, he asked, "Are there any more people aboard?" "I don't think so, sir. Would you like me to check the lavatories to make sure?" "Yes, if you don't mind." She trotted off, checking the stalls at the fore and aft ends of the plane, and came back shaking her head. "They're all empty, sir." "Okay, thank you," he replied, becoming increasingly perplexed. He left the plane himself and found a quiet corner of the terminal. The first order of business was to call his wife back in Natick, not terribly far from the plane's point of origin, which he did. Josie answered after the third ring. "Hello? Hey, it's John." "John? Do you know what time it is? Where are you? Is everything all right?" She was alert now, and her voice betrayed the fact. "I'm fine. I'm in Utah, and I know it's late." He paused, unsure of what he'd intended to say. "It was a rough flight. We had a lot of turbulence, some engine trouble. I just wanted to tell you I love you." She was quiet for a moment. "I love you too." "Okay, well, I'll let you get back to sleep. Good night, hon." "Good night." The call had disturbed Josie. That much had been clear to her husband. It had been equally disconcerting to the man beside her. After hanging up, she turned to Alex, her lover of 2 years. "He's in Utah, thank God." He lay back down, exhaling forcefully. "I thought we were in hot water there for a minute," he said. "Me too." Alex fixed her with his deep brown eyes, so different from the pale blue ones of the man she'd married. "When are you going to tell him?" "Soon." "That's what you've been saying for the last 3 months." "I don't want to wait anymore. I want to be with you without having to sneak around." "I know." "Do you love me?" "Yes, Alex, of course." "Then don't put it off, please." "Okay. I'll tell him as soon as he comes back." "Thank you." He hugged her and kissed the top of her head, smelling the mango scent of her shampoo on her dark hair. He hoped she would keep her promise. And she does keep her promise. And he ends up moving to a third-floor apartment, a studio apartment in Waltham. He treats himself to a nice new TV and a new DVD player, goes back to work. He comes back a couple of weeks later and discovers that he has been robbed. It's all gone. So, and no one's seen anything, of course. So he calls the police as a formality, goes and buys himself a new television, a smaller one, to replace the one that he will not see again. He watches it for a little while and he goes back to bed.